Figuring out which defensive players to draft that are going to break out or flame out is difficult any time of the year, but especially early in the offseason. As you plan your IDP drafts, we're here to help with conversations about general strategies and some specific players we're keeping an eye on who were either breakouts, busts, or dealing with injuries in 2024. Welcome to IDP Drafts. All right, welcome in, everybody. Really excited to be here with you this episode where we're going to be focusing on managing uncertainty. So one of the great and frustrating things about fantasy football in general is there is no such thing as a sure thing. And as we're early in the offseason, that uncertainty is as big as it will possibly be. And it gets smaller as free agency goes on. And then whenever the draft happens and then camps open and more information helps us to be smarter drafters. But what do you do in the meantime? So I'm thrilled to be joined by our guest this week. You know him as the host of the IDP Update. You know him as the host of the Start Sit Show, where I've been his guest on a couple of occasions. So it's fun to be turning the tables a little bit. Mr. Jeff Pomazal, welcome in.
Thanks, Scott, for having me on. I appreciate it. This is a fantastic episode, and this is, something that everybody who plays Dynasty Leagues is really chomping at the bit, especially this time of year. Free agency is fast and furious right now. Values are changing like every day, especially with the new assignings of players and things like that. So this is a perfect time to be kind of recovering this type of this topic. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and fantasy drafts, best ball drafts are also starting to get into full swing. You've got the fast draft D-Up contest. We're going to be leveraging some ADP from that as we talk about some players. You've got some other best balls. We're hosting a best ball as part of the IDP drafts show. So if you want to draft with us, more information on that later. And this is one of those times where whether you're thinking about your dynasty leagues and what you're going to be doing in terms of trades, and if you have free agency in your dynasty leagues, how to manage all of these question marks that exist this time of year, but especially if you're doing any actual drafting right now. This is a fun time to draft. I noticed in Underdog's big best ball contests, how many people end up being winners who draft in May and June and what we call the early off season. So there is advantage to be gained by drafting early. And so if you're drafting now or you plan on drafting soon, you're in the right place. So what we're going to do tonight is we'll talk about some general strategies we have. I mentioned three big categories of players earlier who have a lot of uncertainty. Those are players who are coming off of significant injuries, and we're trying to figure out how to bake those injuries into our valuations of them. So Jeff and I will talk you through a little bit of how we think about those, what our thought processes are. We'll talk about some IDP breakouts, players who came out of nowhere in 2024 and how we're approaching them in our 2025 drafts. And then finally, players who were IDP, at least disappointments in 2025 and didn't necessarily live up to their ADP. So throughout these, we'll talk about our general approaches, our strategies to help you think about any player that's dealing with an injury that was a breakout or that was a bust. But we'll also talk about some specific names that we're paying a lot of attention to that are being drafted pretty highly. And we'll put those in the context of the fast draft D-Up ADP and Adam's pre-free agency best ball rankings, which I'm sure are going to be shaking up a little bit here in the pretty near future. But with all of that in mind, let's get started by talking about injured players. So, Jeff, as you're approaching your fantasy football drafts with IDP, how do you approach injured players?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no crystal ball to predict who is going to get injured, how severe, those kind of things. But unfortunately, injuries are something every team has to be able to navigate throughout the season. And like you mentioned, Scott, too, like with the startups and the D-Up drafts right now, you kind of know about those injuries ahead of time. They're not like in-season things you have to deal with. You can navigate them however you choose from the get-go. So if you want to be risk avergent and decide not to draft any of these players, that's your choice. But if you're a manager who is smart about it and looking for value on these players, this is kind of where you can kind of take advantage. And like you said, a lot of these times people who get in these IDP drafts in May and June, those early times, they can really capitalize on these players that are maybe seen as landmines to other teams, but in other people's viewpoints, they're home run hitters. They're the ones that win you the league. So for me, I like to really think about when my roster construction is not to overload my roster with these types of players who are coming off an injury. We've seen countless times, and there's numerous stats saying like the possibility of re-injury or a slow start and things like that. So I don't want to overload my team with too many of these players. I'll look to sprinkle them in, especially if I get them at a discount or a really good value. Like no player is ever like undraftable. There's always a value to be had somewhere. I just try to avoid them in the early rounds. There's a saying that says that you can't win your draft in the early rounds, but you can definitely lose it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that because, these first few rounds, you need your players that are going to be in your lineups most weeks, where, in the later rounds, especially the very late rounds, you're looking for like those 2 or 3 week plays that can shoot in your lineup for a couple times during the season. But these early rounds, these are going to be consistent players. These are going to be like your Max Crosbys who are going to be in your lineups or scoring for you in your D-up drafts, or last year with the Madness. They're probably 14, 15 weeks scoring in your top things in their lineup. So you can't miss here. And so trying to avoid those potential landmines is really important for me anyway. So for me, roster construction's huge. Not going to take too many of them or kind of rely on them too early in the draft. So Scott, where are you feeling on that? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you alluded to it, that I'm a big proponent of not having do not draft lists. The one place where I'll caveat that a little bit is with players whose injuries are so significant where we don't know that they might miss the entire season already. With those guys in deeper drafts, I'm still willing to take a dart throw because there's value in a guy like a DeMarvion Overshone based on what we were able to see him do when he was on the field. But I'm not going to touch him in a format like D-Up where you're only drafting 60 players. You only have 6 people on your roster, and you can't afford to roll the dice for someone who might get you a ton of points the second half of the season or the last couple of weeks of the season. Whereas if you're doing a 26-round draft, then yeah, give me a 20-point player for the playoff weeks. Sign me up. So I'm in agreement with you that everyone has value and that do not draft lists generally don't work out unless you're talking about some very specific formats like the D-Up format. But even then, I think there's room to take some risks with a lot of players. The other thing that I think about is I'm weighing when and if to draft a player who's coming off of an injury is what are the other mitigating factors? So what is their age? We know that it's easier to recover from injuries generally when you're younger than when you're older. I know that from just being a runner and going sledding with my son this winter and taking a spill that had me basically in traction for 4 days that I would have probably not felt at all if I was still in my 20s. So your body changes as you get older. When older players have injuries, I'm a little bit more concerned, and I bake that into their value more than I would for a younger player. If it's someone who is, I hate the label injury prone, but someone who has dealt with injuries in the past, I'm more likely to tune their value down a little bit, be maybe a little bit colder than the market. And then I also like to see what else is happening. So we're recording this in the throes of free agency, where there's a lot of signings happening, a lot of players left to be signed, a lot of players left to be cut still as well. So as the offseason goes on, I pay attention to, there's an injured player on this team. What else are they doing that gives me a signal about this person's likely availability? So those are the big factors that I tend to look at. And when we think about these injured players who have a lot of appeal, who is someone that you wanted to highlight, Jeff?
For me, one of the guys that really pops off was a guy who was drafted very early in several leagues last year, Alex Singleton, linebacker for the Denver Broncos. Right now, currently, he's going up in these D-Up drafts at about 37, being drafted every single time, 100% of the time. And even in a shallow format, he's being he's drafted. He's very highly coveted. Adam has him ranked at the 22nd player right now. I don't know if that is, like you had mentioned earlier, kind of cooked in with like free agency, because a lot has changed in Denver, especially at the linebacking within the last couple of days. They did sign Dre Greenlaw, and so we haven't seen Singleton play alongside a player like Greenlaw before. You know, Cody Barton is.
Yeah, I was gonna say the Cody Barton hate is uncalled for.
Well, okay, yeah. So no shade to Cody Barton, but Dre Greenlaw is in like a different class. But you know, there again, he's a player who's coming off a very significant injury. We saw him maybe come back a little too early, and then was sidelined again. So you know, he's got his own things going on. But I'm here to focus on Singleton right now. I'm not as much worried about the injury. It happened really early in the season last year. I think it happened in week 3. He finished out the game not even knowing that he tore his ACL. The ACLs aren't the death sentence that they used to be. The thing that does have me a little concerned, though, is he's going into age 31. This is his 11th season in the NFL. I didn't think that he was that old already in the league. Like, you know, he's already in he's on the back 9 of his career here. And so not only do we have competition in Dre Greenlaw coming off an injury after the age of 31, there was some talk about Denver possibly cutting him as a cap casualty to save $6 million. So you factor all of those things in. Now, all of a sudden, Singleton's not as appealing as he was, you know, this time last year. So I feel there's still value there to be had. I don't think he's quite in the 22 where maybe Adam had him ranked earlier. And again, that's probably pre-Dre Greenlaw signing and stuff like that. But he's probably, for me, he's probably a little closer to that 37th. And even now, probably even a little bit later, he's probably going to be, you know, in these D-up drafts, he's probably going to be pushing, you know, that late 4th, 5th, 6th round even for me, as opposed to, you know, early 3rd or late 3rd, early 4th for me right now. So what are your thoughts on Mr. Singleton?
Yeah, I like Singleton. I traded for him in a dynasty league towards the end of last year. It was a team that was out of contention for me, and so I needed to, you know, unload some talent and get some draft picks and some injured players back. And he was someone I targeted and was really happy to have. But again, that's in a different kind of format. I would be comfortable holding him if we were talking about buy, sell, and hold in dynasty. But when it comes to investing draft capital right now, if I was doing a dynasty startup, if I'm definitely doing a best ball, I would have some pause. Like you said, he's 31, and I'm sure people are already thinking, well, 31's not that old for a linebacker, and it's not. Look at Bobby Wagner and Levante David and Demario Davis. The big difference there is they haven't been dealing with significant injuries these past couple of years. Singleton doesn't have the injury history, but he is 31, is coming off a significant injury. So I'm with you in terms of where I'm at with Adam versus the market. I'm probably a little bit behind the market. I've done a fair number of these D-up drafts, and I think where I'd really start to consider him is if he's there in probably the 5th. And depending on my roster construction, going back to your point earlier, how risk taking or risk averse my roster is to that point. But he's intriguing. We know he can do it, but this early in the offseason, with the Greenlaw signing, with some of those other mitigating factors, I'm probably closer to the market or a little bit lower. And I'll be interested to see, like you said, how Adam's best ball rankings adjust, because he is constantly tweaking these things. So they may have even been adjusted by the time you hear this and you go on the idpshow.com and you see, oh, he's not 22 anymore. Or maybe he's a flag plant and he is going to stay there. So we'll just have to see.
Scott, when you're looking at Singleton, like say he stays healthy this season, Greenlaw is healthy this season. You said that you traded for him in a dynasty league. Where are you happy to see him finish? Like, obviously, we want him to be LB1 if we traded for him in a league. But where are you like realistically happy for him to finish this season? Like LB?
Yeah, I think if he finishes as an LB2, early LB3, early LB3, I'd still be happy. Mostly because I play in a lot of large format leagues with 12 teams, 16 teams where we're starting 11 IDP. And so, you know, you need to have not just LB1s. Not everyone can have all LB1s. I think if he has that kind of season, it will be a success for me. I think I got about the equivalent of I gave up about the equivalent of a fourth for him whenever I traded for him in that dynasty league. So I didn't give up a ton. He was really a toss in to even out a trade. So I think, his ceiling is absolutely still LB1, probably back end LB1. But if he at least hits a floor of a high end LB3, then I'll be comfortable with that in my dynasty league. In my D-up drafts and in my other best ball drafts, if I'm going to be taking him where Adam has him at 22, I would want a whole lot more performance than that. Yep. And even if I'm where the market is at 37 and he ends up as an LB3, I'd be pretty concerned about that.
Yep. Yeah, because I know last year in the Madness, he was like the LB12. He was like the back end LB1 going 33rd overall. Like that's a significant investment in a player, and he made, he had 3 very productive weeks when he was active last week. He had double-digit scoring all 3 weeks that he played. So he definitely returned value. Unfortunately, it was only for, a sixth of the season. And in investing that early of a pick, we're looking at like a third-round pick in a not in a dynasty league, in a best ball format. That's significant. You're only going to get him for 3 weeks of the season. Like, like you said, you're going to need to get some insulated value there, maybe in that 5th, 6th round at least to return value.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the things that is going to be a recurring issue with these players, all the categories of players that we're talking about tonight, whether it's someone coming off an injury or a great year or a bad year, they have more risk baked into them than your players who were just good last year. And we expect them to be good again this year because they were good the year before that. There's no seeming trajectory about which way things are going. There's no injury that's confounding things. And so, as we're thinking about all of these guys, I think there's going to be variation between the market, between Adam's pre-free agency, best ball rankings, and also people's individual risk tolerances. And another guy who I think really epitomizes this tension, and it's really apparent if you look at some of the different ratings that are out there, is Nakobe Dean. So Nakobe Dean has a D-up ADP of 48.3, and Adam has him as IDP 113. I think a lot of this is very clearly being driven by the injury. So the ADP is being driven by his performance. He was a revelation last year. He was almost like a breakout. We could have put him in that category as well if he wasn't dealing with an injury. If you look at his performance, he was IDP 22 overall last season. So he is a great asset to have. But when I think about those criteria I was mentioning before, age, not a concern. He's a young guy. Injury history, yeah, if you remember, he was going to be a 1st round pick, and then he ended up being a 3rd round pick because of a different body part, a pec tear, but still a significant injury that dropped him back there. This nature of this injury being the patellar tendon, which has a 6 to 12 month recovery after surgery, which is a pretty wide window, makes me concerned, and the timing of it happening wild card week. So I can understand where Adam's coming in at probably just projecting maybe a half a season of Dean, which would have him that far down. But if you look at the market, he's being drafted as if he is going to finish as probably an LB2, LB3 at absolute worst. When it comes to my take, I'm in between. He's a 6th round flyer to me. I have him in 2 of my D-up drafts that I've done so far. I'm probably not getting more shares. That's as much of that risk as I want with Dean. Love the player. If he has a super speedy recovery, awesome. But we know this is the season for liars when it comes to free agency rumors, and everyone is ahead of schedule in their recovery, and everyone is in the best shape of their lives. So, I think you have to bake in a lot of this uncertainty when it comes to Nakobe Dean.
Yeah. And I'm with you here. Like when he's on the field, he's super productive, but like you also said, he hasn't been really the poster child for being healthy. And sometimes the best ability is availability. And if, like you said, if you're banking, especially in one of these D-up drafts where you have a very limited roster, you're really trying to hit lightning in a bottle on every single one of these picks, because you really can't afford to have a guy gone for, 30, 40, 50% of your season. And Dean's kind of had a track record for being absent for most of that, or for many of the seasons that he's played, and how much of a factor is a guy that we're going to talk about a little bit later, like Zack Baun, how much is his all of a sudden role on the team start to play into this? And I know that has nothing to do with injury, but that's another one of those factors to kind of consider. Like, you know, that defense is all of a sudden very filled with a lot of great playmakers. And, you know, maybe Dean isn't rushed back because they're saving him for another playoff run, you know, so that all those things kind of play a factor in those things. And playing those D up drafts where you have very limited spots, kind of dicey to be taking them in the 48th pick, like the end of the 4th round, beginning of the 5th round. So
yeah, and I will say the other really fun thing about those D-up drafts, and if you haven't done one yet, give them a try. They're a lot of fun. They're incredibly fast, almost stressfully fast, because you only have 20 seconds, and if you get sniped, it's that real moment of panic. But the other fun thing about those is you have to put boosters on 4 players, 2 times, a 1.75, a 1.5, and a 1.25. He's not getting boosters in the rosters that he's on for me. He's going to be a flat 1 just because I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm not about to use up any of that premium on a player like him, even though he was pretty much a breakout last year, like I mentioned. But fortunately, there are some other breakouts who are not dealing with injuries. And so when we think about players from 2024 who had amazing seasons seemingly out of nowhere, the list is plentiful. You know, there was a lot of different directions we could have gone here. But in terms of sort of the general thought process that I have, at least whenever I approach these guys in best ball drafts, really throughout the offseason, because these are people who, you know, we know a little bit more about than waiting to find out what's going to happen with an injury. And the things I look at are twofold. First is the capital invested in them and around them. So a lot of times when players have that breakout year, they'll get a new deal, or they'll at least demand a new deal. So paying attention to who is being rumored for a new contract before their contract is up, who is getting that paycheck beforehand, is a very strong signal that the team is invested. Conversely, there may be strong signals that the team is not invested in the breakout. Look at Special Agent Jack Sanborn, who had that great end of the season for the Bears a few years ago. I remember he was being traded for 2nd and 3rds in some of my dynasty leagues. Then they bring in Tremaine Edmonds and TJ Edwards, and it's like, okay, there is no spot for him here. So even though he looked like an IDP breakout, it just wasn't going to pan out moving forward. And I think he just signed somewhere new today, so he might be that guy at his next stop. But looking again at the capital invested in and around the player, we have more of that information as free agency plays out, as draft capital is spent, as other things happen throughout the offseason, is one of the ways that I determine how much I want to buy into a breakout or not. And then the second factor for me is looking at the circumstances that allowed for that breakout. So was there something really unique or interesting that led to this happening? You know, like in New York last year, CJ Mosley suddenly got hurt. Jamian Sherwood stepped in. If he hadn't signed with the Jets already in free agency, he would have been a really interesting conversation about what do we do here, given the circumstances of his ascendancy. Because the Jets also just cut CJ Mosley, so I don't think we have to worry about Mosley retaking that position. But most situations aren't that cut and dry. So I like to look at what led the player to have a chance to have that breakout, and if it seems like those cards are still on the table, or if things might be a little bit different. And I know that's one of the things that you look at, Jeff, as you go through sort of your criteria for breakouts that you want to buy into, or breakouts that you might be fading a little bit.
Yeah, and for the record, Sanborn signed with the Cowboys today. So
Cowboys, yeah.
So, kind of in line with what you're thinking here too, Scott, is I don't like to overvalue last year's production, especially in the IDP world. All of our listeners know that there's so much turnover from season to season with every position, even more so as you get further and further away from the ball. You know, defensive linemen versus linebackers versus defensive backs. That discussion we've had till we're blue in the face. But there's so much turnover from year to year, converse to like the traditional offensive leagues. And so, you know, a variety of factors. Is there a scheme change, like you mentioned? Is there a change in team? did they add players, or did that team lose players maybe to like draw attention away from a player to free that person up? Or now is that person the number one target on the offensive line, or that team's like going to scheme to block him? Last year they had a player that took away the attention and he was freed up for a lot of one-on-ones, and he may have had a successful season with that, but now all of a sudden he's the main guy that they're going to scheme against. So now is his production going to go down? Obviously injury and just that overall efficiency. So looking at, are those stats repeatable? Tackles are very like predictable almost number with things, but sacks and interceptions, not so much. Like Trayvon Diggs set the record in 2021 with like 11 interceptions or something like that. And he had a huge, massive year. He was like, had 219 points in Big Three scoring, but then that very next year, he went to 139 points, and he played one more game that year than he did in his record-setting year. So like, and clearly going from 11 interceptions to 3, but everyone was chasing in 2022 that Diggs as a defensive back to roster, because, he just put up 219 points. He's going to do it again. Well, interceptions and sacks are really not stats to be chasing, because they're so unpredictable. And, sacks, we've seen players trip and fall, and all of a sudden they get credit for a sack and things like that. So it's really tough to predict those from season to season. So, maybe looking at pressure rates, that's maybe a little bit more of a safe area to do. So yeah, just looking for those stats that are probably more predictable or repeatable, and not looking for those regression. We talk about touchdown regression in offensive leagues. Here we have to worry about sack and interception regression. So who's a player for you, Scott, that broke out that you're fairly safe, fairly confident in drafting this year?
Yeah, so I think the biggest name that gets floated around for good reason, he's being talked about on every IDP free agency show, and we alluded to him earlier, was Zack Baun. So Zack Baun, this is one player where the markets and Adam are very, very well aligned. And this was pre-free agency, so I don't expect there's going to be much movement in either of these numbers moving forward. Where Adam has him as his 11th overall IDP in his best ball rankings over at the IDPshow.com. And his D-up ADP is 10.8. So you can't get any closer than that. In terms of my position, I have no shares right now. Like you said, everyone has a value. I think he did land in the best possible spot to repeat his performance coming back to the Eagles. You look at the money they invested in him, there's no chance he's going to be losing his spot anytime soon. Even if he has some down weeks, he's got the capital invested in him where he's going to get that opportunity. But we were talking earlier about Nakobe Dean, and it'll be interesting to see what Baun looks like without a Dean next to him. We'll see if it's Trotter or if they bring someone else in. I think that will also be kind of telling for Dean's status and how much of the season he might be able to play. I mentioned it's a 6 to 12 month injury. Well, 6 months from the surgery is the middle of July, where he could be ready for week 1. 12 months, do the math. It's a lot further into the season. So I still like Baun. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be drafting Baun. I'm just probably about a round behind both Adam and the market, but that may have more to do with my individual risk tolerance than anything to do with Baun and where he is and his ability to repeat his breakout performance from last year. Jeff, what do you think about Baun?
I love Baun. Like, obviously he's a Wisconsin Badger. He's the alum, so that we got that going for him. And Jack Sanborn too. So we got a lot of Badger love here at the linebacker position tonight. But looking at where he was last year, and I know Madness, we referenced it a couple times, but last year he was linebacker 77. He was behind Dean and Devin White being drafted as a Philadelphia linebacker. Now you fast forward a year from now he's legit talked about as a dynasty LB1, not the one, but a LB1. Going forward. And that's in his 5th season. We never heard of this guy. He was so irrelevant when he played in New Orleans, and now he's got this new scheme, and he just took off running. I would be more worried about Baun if he went somewhere else in free agency and not used in Philadelphia. But thankfully he re-signed in Philly, so he's probably going to retain, that value. I don't think there's a lot of ceiling here right now. Like, you're drafting Baun at his ceiling. If you're drafting him with the 1st round pick, it's hard for him to return value there, And so for me, like you, if he's available in the 2nd, I'm happy with there. But you're almost kind of drafting a player at a ceiling here with Baun. Like we've run the juice on him, clearly last year being like the 77th linebacker, and he was legit LB1. Like you're not going to get a better return on investment than that.
Mm-hmm.
So here, I think you kind of cashed out already with his value. And, I'm going to take my chances on another player in the first round and see if I can find the next Zack Baun this season. So
I am proud to announce that Fast Draft now has an all defense game called D Up. That's right, fans of IDP finally have a real money best ball game that they can play. No more manually setting up leagues every time you want to do a draft. No. Now you can play for 10 grand, 2,000 to first. Could draft up to 30 teams, all defense. And the best part, balanced scoring, tackles for loss, pass breakups. It all factors in. Just draft 6 defensive players, top 4 into your lineup every week. It's that easy. It's so easy that this isn't just for IDP people. If you love the NFL, then you'll love this game. And for the first time with Fast Draft, you can sweat both sides of the ball on Sunday. So use your host promo code to get a $25 deposit match, and you'll love this D-Up contest because it's about time we got one.
Yeah, and you mentioned not chasing that ever elusive fifth-year breakout. But one time where we do see some growth is that third year. And a player who had a really good third-year breakout last year is someone I know that you wanted to discuss in terms of the repeatability of his performance and his draft capital. And let's talk a little bit about Nick Bonitto.
So I'm going to come across as a Nick Bonitto hater. It's going to sound like, but it's not so much the player, but it's just that he was so efficient last season. He was like the Alex Van Ginkel 2.0 last season. Like if we didn't have Alex Van Ginkel last season, everyone would be talking about Nick Bonitto here because he had an amazing season. He came out of nowhere. He was drafted as the 79th defensive lineman last year in Madness. But now he's like vaulted up into almost back in second round. Here he's kind of going in D up 34. So he's kind of in that second, third round range. That's, again, a very high ceiling for a player to return value. Last year, he had 48 tackles, 14 sacks, 2 forced fumbles on just 690 snaps. And so he had 231 points in Big 3 scoring. And I know that's not really relevant for D up, but it just kind of gives us some context about like how truly amazing his season was. He was like the third defensive lineman last year. Unfortunately, I feel that that's going to cause him to be overdrafted this season just because managers will be chasing last year's numbers. And even if he regresses a little bit to like a 9 or 10 sack season, it's still a great season, but it's not the 14 sack season that managers drafted him to be, and so, everything worked in Bonitto's favor last season. He had a pressure rate of about on his 429 pass rushing snaps. He had pressure on 61 of those. So he had 14% pass rusher rate, which is really, really good. He was only slightly behind Will Anderson, and he had a 20 with that. And so if you think about both of those seasons, both of them had about 60 pressures. Both had 14, 15 sacks. If you were to have to invest money on who's going to repeat or who has a better chance to repeat, are you going to invest your money on Nick Bonitto or are you going to go Will Anderson? And I don't think there's many out there that can truthfully say, oh, I'm going to go, Nick here. And so if you're taking a player like you're in the headlights, who are you going to take? It's probably going to be Will Anderson there. So, I do like Nick Bonitto as a player. I just feel that, again, you're drafting him at a ceiling. There's not a lot of good return here. He's on the same team. He's got great draft capital. I think he was a second round draft pick. He's got the same role on defense with Vance Joseph returning. So there's not a lot of change in his world. I just think that we're going to have some regression here to like maybe 8, 9, 10 sacks. Plus he had 2 defensive touchdowns last season, which is a huge boost in scoring. So again, like we talked about earlier, what are those repeatable stats? I don't know as a defensive player, I can count on 2 defensive touchdowns unless your name is JJ Watt and you're playing tight end. So what are your thoughts on Nick Bonitto there?
Well, before I share a couple of my thoughts, I was curious. So, Adam has him as a late third. The market data has him as an early fourth. Are both of those numbers a little bit too high for your taste? Would you take him a little bit later than that? Or do one of these jump out at you more than the other?
I would have to take him later. Like I'm going to let somebody else draft him at that high of a price. I think there's better value to be had in that early second. late third range, right? Kind of where he's going. I just don't see that a repeatable chance for him here this season. A great player. I have him in a couple dynasty leagues, and I'll roll him out in my league that I start 4 defensive linemen. No problems at all. But again, trying to win one of these D-up drafts, you've got to hit every single one, and if a player like Baun is going to return on investment exactly what you drafted him in, that's not a league winner. That's not a D-up league winner. Nick Bonitto, if you draft him in the 3rd round and he puts up DL3 numbers or, overall defensive player 3, you're not winning, and I like to win. I don't like to lose. So if I'm going to let somebody else not really fall on a landmine, because he's definitely not a landmine as a player, but he's not going to win me my league here. So, I'll pass on him at 27, 34, but maybe as he creeps into that late 3rd round at the turn of the 4, that's the time maybe I pounce. So.
Yeah, and I have seen him going there in some of the D-up drafts. And again, to be clear, there's more drafts other than the D-up. We run some other best balls. I know Adam has already ran one. We're hosting a combined one with offense and IDP right now as part of the show. And those drafts tend to have a lot more IDP players taken. I think one of the reasons we keep coming back to D-up is because it really amplifies that adage that you mentioned earlier. The drafts aren't won in the early rounds, but they're certainly lost. And in D-up, they're all pretty much early rounds. And if you have a big swing and a big miss, especially in like round 1 or 2, it is going to set you up to be in a tough position. Now, that said, having seen what I've seen in terms of the drafts that I've been in so far, edges in particular go early and often. I end up having a little bit more linebacker heavy builds. And so I have drafted Bonitto twice. And one of the cool things about D-up is it gives you your individual ADP on a player. And my individual ADP is 26.5. So one time I probably took him a little bit early. One time I got him more of a value. I remember a 3rd draft, I wanted him in the 4th and missed him by just 1 pick. So that would have brought my individual ADP down lower. But I'm probably closer to Adam. I think a lot of the defensive ends have that variability. I think as we're learning D-up strategy with the bonuses and those multipliers, there is more of an emphasis, right or wrong, on the boom bust players like a Bonitto, who we won't be able to pencil in for 2 touchdowns again. But if he has those multiple sack games and you have your 2x multiplier on him, he can be someone who can get you in a really nice position in the overall standings. So, I believe, like you, that regression is coming. He was going to
ask you, Scott, where do you feel comfortable with your multiplier on a player like him? Obviously, if you're going to draft, typically in those drafts, if you're drafting a 1st round player, you're probably going to put your bigger multipliers on them because you're counting on them to be your moneymaker. If you're drafting Bonitto in the 3rd, 4th round, what kind of multiplier you feel comfortable putting on him?
Yeah, I'll say this. Stay tuned because our next episode is just going to be about the up draft strategy with the one and only Josh Raymer. And we're going to be talking about because he's done even more than I have. And so we're going to be doing a D-up draft is the plan. And we're going to be talking about our strategies. I'll tell you, in those 2 leagues, I think I have about my 1.5. But the other little tease that I'll mention is just because I take a player in the 1st or 2nd round, I don't always put the 2x or the 1.75x on those players. If I end up going linebacker early, I'll tend to have those safer points as my smaller multipliers sandwiched in between some edges who have the bigger multipliers and then just sort of those flat scores to help give me boost. But if you find this stuff really interesting, we're going to do an entire episode on it. Come back, tune in 2 weeks because Josh and I will just be geeking out all over D-up draft strategy and multipliers. But I think it's a really interesting question and one we're going to spend a good bit of time on here pretty soon.
You guys will be like the Randy Marsh meme with the internet picture, right? So you guys will be all good.
All right, moving right along.
Yep.
So our last category is unfortunately players who are busts in 2024. There's lots of reasons someone could be labeled a bust, but the thing that they have in common is they didn't end up in the top end of the rankings. So when it comes to not being afraid of busts or just shying away from them entirely, well, not entirely, because we've both said we're kind of everybody's got a price, Ted DiBiase kind of guys that will get someone there at some point. When you think about handling the uncertainty of a 2024 bust, what are some of the things that you look for?
When I look at bust, I think, being in the position that we're in, and we're almost paralysis by analysis. We do all of these data dives, and we got charts and graphs and really cool looking colored charts to look at, and like, all these players are going to break out and their RAS scores and all that kind of stuff. We almost caused overdrafting because of overhyping a player, reading into a situation that, we can make a narrative however we want. Super guilty of this last year myself. I thought KJ Britt was going to be like the second coming last year. Like, everything was lined up for this guy. Like, he had a great 3 or 4 weeks to end the season. Devin White was traded away. Coaches were talking up how he was playing. Players on the defense loved how he was taking control and playing the defense. I had so many shares of KJ Britt across IDP Madness, Dynasty Leagues, and I was almost buying like jerseys. It was sick. And then the guy just crap the bed. And like everything was there. And, that's probably my fault by over analyzing all of the stuff that was going on. I had this narrative, like he was my flag plant guy, and I wanted to be so right about him. But unfortunately, it just never panned out because of whatever reason. He just never got the opportunity, got kind of dinged up. They had this whole rotation of stuff. So I feel like when players are bust, it's more so because of, groupthink, overdrafting, this overhyping of a player and stuff like that. So shame on us for, overdrafting or overhyping a player when he shouldn't be. So,
well, I am not going to engage in groupthink with you because I love paralysis.
I know.
So, like, my big takeaway when it comes to dealing with busts is to do some of that analysis. Why were they busts in the first place? What were their underlying advanced metrics? So if you're talking about a defensive tackle, defensive end, what was their pressure rate? What was their pressure to sack conversion rate compared to something like their PFF pass rush grade? If they were grading out really well, but weren't necessarily getting the pressures that matched that, or they were getting the pressures, but they weren't necessarily getting the sacks that on average you get with that kind of a grade, it makes me less likely to penalize them more for those bust years, and makes me, I guess, ready to be hurt again and to go back and go to that well and give the person another try. So I don't know if I'm just the eternal optimist. I'm always looking for the bright side of people, or I just love numbers, or all three. But I love trying to understand what led it to happen, because sometimes you figure out pretty quickly, yeah, this guy was a mirage and we were overhyping him. And sometimes you figure out, okay, the circumstances changed or the underlying metrics were still good, where I'm willing to give him another try.
And I think that's where value starts to play a key. Like some of these players, like you said, with the advanced metrics about, are they getting pressure rates but not the sacks? Well, instead of talking about him here as being a bust, we were talking about him 15, 20 minutes ago as being a breakout in this episode. So if a player like this all of a sudden, like, maybe slides more to where they kind of belong in a draft, all of a sudden, wow, they're a good value. Now all of a sudden they're a breakout player rather than a bust because of where they were drafted. So a player like that, and I know Eric Harms loves this guy. Eric Harms is beating the drum every day for Kayvon Thibobeaux. He really doesn't. He doesn't like him at all. He was so out on him last year. But Thibodeaux is one of those players that's super polarizing right now. Like, either like, I'm kind of coming around on him with his current ADP right now. Like, this is probably a little more accurate of where he's at. Last year, he was going right around DL 13, overall 18th in those IDP Madness drafts that we're doing. And that's a heavy investment. You're like thinking about him at that 1-2 turn, because if I don't take him now, he's not going to make it back to me on the comeback. So I have to decide, is he a player that I want? he's got the draft capital. He's got all the metrics. He was playing opposite of Brian Burns. Like, there's nothing that screams this guy shouldn't be efficient. But like Jake mentioned in the last episode that you guys did together, he wasn't available. Like he missed these big gaps in the season, and he was trying to come back. I think we kind of get sucked in, like going back to my earlier comment about the paralysis by analysis. Everything was kind of set up for this guy. His rookie season, he had a monster 3 games to end his rookie season. Like, he had a 40-point game versus Washington in that late run in that rookie season. And we're all salivating like, second year breakout. He had 17 games in his second year. He racked up 50 tackles, 11.5 sacks. Third year breakout. Here it comes. This is the season. They put it together. And then we all got hosed because we overdrafted, because we had this plan in our head of what was going to happen, and it didn't come to fruition. Now the market's kind of corrected itself. Now we see him going. Adams got him at 41. This D-up draft, who probably a lot of drafters got burned by him by taking him early when they did. They're like, he's out. Now he's got value. Now kind of getting him in that 4th round, that 5th round, maybe get him in that 6th round with your last pick. Now all of a sudden this gets pretty appealing. He plays opposite of Brian Burns. He's got Sexy Dexy in the middle causing havoc. Like all of a sudden, like, again, I'm doing it to myself, just like you said you do. You're like, this is the season. I'm ready to get hurt again. But he's a player that could possibly, return on some value here, especially with their secondary improved. They saw in Paulson Adebo from the Saints. They got lockdown nickel corner and Drew Phillips. There's a lot of optimism. Everyone's a winner. Everyone's a Super Bowl contender here in March. But he's one of those players that, like, you know what? I can't invest in the 1st and 2nd round turn anymore, but 5th, 6th, color me interested. So what are your thoughts on Thibodeaux and my little rant?
Yeah. So I am closer to the market in that I am unconvinced that he is going to put it together again the way that he put it together in year 2. His year 3 numbers were actually right in between his year 1 and year 2. So it was kind of a regression to the mean situation. Granted, he missed some time. And to his credit, he put together his best PFF pass rush grade ever at 72. But the issue I have is, if you project him out for another 150 pass rush snaps and maintaining his career average pressure rate and pressure to sack ratio, it gets him 3 more sacks. So granted, he could get more than that, but if he gets 3 sacks, then he moves up to around IDP 150 in terms of his performance. So he needs to, like, more than improve. He needs to double or triple, get back to those 2023 numbers to make him really worth that 5th round draft capital, or even the 6th. The reason I have that 6.3 in parentheses with him here is to note that he's only been drafted in 6.3% of D-up drafts. So an ADP of 60 is the lowest ADP you can have because there's 60 players taken. So anytime we have someone like that, it's important to note how often they're being taken, because all 60s aren't created equally. So I think there might be some value. I might take him as a 6th round flyer in some of my drafts if I have a very risk averse build to that point. If I've, say, gone linebacker heavy and maybe, I waited too long on edge and I need to have that upside somewhere, and he's sitting there in the 6th round, sure, I'll take a swing. But he's not someone who I'm going to be seeking out in very many drafts, because I just don't know that he's going to put together that 2023 year again. I can't help but wonder if that was somewhat of an anomaly.
No, I could definitely get behind that. And like you said, I think the biggest takeaway with all this is, my view of him might be more of a dynasty view. Like, like there's some upside there in those 3-4 leagues, but you're talking 60 players deep in these D-up drafts, like you can't have a miss, like if you have any chance of winning multiple leagues or winning a big one, you can't have a Thibodeaux laying an egg for you, with any kind of multiplier at all, and so, like, I think, the D-up drafters are probably pretty savvy to stay away from him. And with Adams ranking, he's kind of got that he's got that optimism that he's probably going to come around and put it together. And, so we'll kind of see.
And honestly, when I think about, the 25 round drafts, which is one of the pretty standard draft length that we do when we do the IDP only drafts through the show, I can talk myself into taking him a little bit higher. It just changes my composition a little bit.
Yep.
So I'm very much someone who does, and we talked about this last episode, I'll do an evaluation after round 6 or 8 to see what my roster looks like. And if I have guys like Thibodeaux or the next guy we're going to mention, or really several of the guys that we've talked about tonight that have a lot of this uncertainty associated with them, then I'll just draft more of that position. I'll hedge more. I won't take as many shots at defensive back if I've taken some safeties early and I have a little bit more safe points there. But if I have the Thibodeaux and the Bonittos in the 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds, then I'll probably take a few more swings with some defensive tackles or edges later in the draft and probably not take as many linebackers or as many defensive backs. So I can see where Adam's coming from on this, because we have seen the talent, we have seen the flashes, and depending on the format, you probably will have to spend close to a 4th or a 5th to be able to get him. I think the D-up drafts are, you kind of mentioned, a little bit of a different animal because you're dealing with such a small roster where I suspect the team that wins is going to have a pretty aggressive risk profile, but good luck figuring out which risky plays are going to work out at any point in the offseason, let alone on, mid-March, which is part of the reason why we're doing it this week, is so we can think about these things long-term and what are the smart ways to make these decisions. And when we think about, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
No, I was just going to kind of piggyback. So in your bigger drafts, where are you comfortable taking a player like a Thibodeaux, or is it a 5th, 6th round? And then, like you said, that roster construction becomes really important later on, or are you going to fade to the point where he's there in the 7th, I'll take a shot on him?
Yeah. So in the first IDP only draft that we've done this offseason, I was picking from the number 1 spot. So he was available at 412. I'm sorry. He was available at that, the 2-3 turn. That was way too rich for my blood.
Yep.
I was giving him consideration if he would have made it to 412, but he ended up going 4.7. So I think sort of that end of the 4th, early 5th would be a place that I would look at him, especially if I have built more of a linebacker, like a true linebacker heavy build. Sure. If I have a lot of those dual Desi guys, I'm less concerned about that kind of thing. But if I have a lot of traditional linebackers, like in this draft, I have Oluokun, Okereke, and Edmonds I took in 2, 3, and 4. And so I was looking to build a little bit more risk in terms of high upside linebacker, defensive lineman. So Thibodeaux for that roster would have been good, but I ended up getting Chop Robinson, who had a great end of the year at 5-1 in that draft. And I would not be shocked. I think it's definitely within the realm of possibility that Robinson ends up with a better 2025 than Thibodeaux. So I wasn't really too upset that I missed out there.
Do you feel at all and this is again going back into those narrative pieces, so Thibodeau's going into his 4th year, looking to have that 5th round rookie option, exercise. Is there any extra motivation for him? Is he a player that feels like he needs that little bump to get going, or is,
Yeah, I would love to see a good study on that, because every NFL player has a 4th. Well, not every NFL player. Some players don't make it to the 4th year, but most 1st round draft picks. Let me put that barrier on here. Yep. Most 1st round draft picks do get to make it to their 4th year because they have that capital to see. Everyone thinks even if they're a bad player, this could be the coach that could be the one that turns things around for them. Most of them, we know, don't get their 5th year option picked up. So they all have that motivation. And every year, a solid chunk of the league is in a contract year. So they all have that motivation to, keep playing or to keep their job. And so I'd be surprised if there's a significant correlation between contract year and player performance, just because so many players are playing for contracts every year, and the way so many contracts are structured where teams have outs after 1 year or 2 years, you're playing for your job almost every year anymore. So I get that narrative, and I like to believe those things and believe in like revenge games and things like that too. But I don't know if they're reality or if they're just kind of things that we tell ourselves because they're cool stories. And, there have been plenty of guys who have had breakouts when they happen to be in a contract year, but there have been a whole lot more guys
Right.
who really didn't do much and then got a 1 year deal and another 1 year deal and another 1 year deal. And then we're out of the league.
Yeah. Well, you have a player right now that doesn't have to worry about a 4th or 5th
No.
year option yet. So
No,
who's the player you want to kind of talk about here?
We've got a young guy. And again, I'm not labeling him as a bust in any kind of a way. This is talking about, as we're thinking about 2024 performances and projecting towards 2025, sort of these criteria that we use. And I wanted to talk about Laitu Latu. So I think he showed a lot of flashes. I think there is a lot to be hopeful for increased performance for Latu. He is being drafted in a majority of the drafts. He has an ADP that is lower than 60. It's 55.4. Adam has him at 39. I think some things that happened this week help him with Dayo Odengbo leaving. I mean, that vacates. Let me see. I jotted this down. 745 snaps that Odengbo played on edge. So there's definitely going to be increased opportunity for him. It's also funny how similar his advanced metrics are to Kayvon Thibobeaux in all ways except one. So Thibodeaux was a 72 pass rush grade last year. Latu was a 72.1. Their pass rush snaps to pressure rates were both between 10.5, 10.7%. The big difference is that Latu's pressure to sack ratio wasn't nearly as good as Thibodeaux's, which was also very kind of mid. So if we see marked improvement, then Latu could be worth that sort of dart throw 6th. But I think he was IDP 249 last year. That would be a hell of a jump to end up in the top 60 overall, let alone the top 40 overall. Love to see it. He seems like a really interesting player, has talent, obviously can do it. But those are the kind of bets that even in long format drafts, I'm not comfortable making. If he was sitting there in the 6th, yeah, I'll take him. If he was sitting there in the 7th, then absolutely I would run and grab him. But in something like a D up, he is a 6th round dart throw to me. I think he's going to improve. He's going to have positive regression. We often talk about regression to the mean as a bad thing of, your 2 touchdowns aren't going to be repeatable. But if you're also having the second worst pressure to sack ratio of every edge rusher graded 72 or above last season, then odds are you're going to have some positive regression towards the mean where those numbers are going to convert better. But I have a hard time seeing them converting, going from an 8% guy to like a league leading 22% guy, which is the kind of jump he would need to warrant being drafted in that late 3rd, early 4th. So he's a dart throw to me. I have hope for him, love him for dynasty, but for best ball purposes, there's a lot that gives me a little bit of pause. And I think some of that's just with young guys in general. I think Verse is poised to have a good year because he underperformed his metrics. So I'm not taking him in the 1st round, but I do have an interest there. So I'm not anti 2nd year player overall. I worry that we overdrafted Latu a little bit last year. He was ADP 65.4, ended up as IDP 249. He is going to take a jump, I would imagine, but there's just been a jump and a leap, and I don't have that much confidence in him taking that massive leap.
Yeah, like you said, for him to return here, he's going to have to be significantly, and even if he improves like into the 120s, that's a great season. That's a great growth, but still not going to be worth the drafting in these D up drafts. Do you feel that sometimes like we as managers like want to chase those rookies. We want that breakout. We're almost like we want to be the guy that drafts them just so we draft that young guy. Just be like, yes, I knew it. I knew Latu in the 6 was going to hit this year. And, it's just kind of like, again, we write those narratives. We want to be that. We want to be right. We want it to be our guy, and so I think Latu is like kind of falling into that kind of like rookie fever still, kind of that the fun name. We want that. We want that on our roster.
Yeah. And I think the worst is when you hit on one of those guys, because then it just builds up this hubris. Like I was a huge Cordero Patterson guy coming out of the draft. And I stuck with him, especially in return leagues. And he ended up winning me multiple championships in some of my return leagues. I was a big Marcus Jones guy. I drafted him in every single one of my dynasty drafts. And that rookie year, he paid off because he got some of those offensive snaps and he was doing returns and he got significant defensive playing time. But that does build up some hubris that, you know what, I'm going to hold on to this, because we've all also been on the other side of it. I've cut bait on Budda Baker too early and Nick Cross too early and, several other players. Those are just the two pain points that I still feel for moving on from them at some point well before I should have. So I think, and this alludes to a point that you made earlier, it's important if you play a lot of dynasty, like I know you and I do, to be able to take your dynasty hat off. Not just when you're doing redraft, but especially when you're doing best ball, because it's a different animal and you can't, if you're doing a 25 round draft, you can fall into some of those traps towards the end, but you don't want to be doing them early. And if you're only doing a 6 round draft with only 10 teams in the draft, so 60 players getting drafted, you have to be able to take a step back and be a non-unrealistic dynasty drafter thinking your guys are finally going to put it together this year.
That's a tough hat to take off sometimes. So
yeah. All right, Jeff. Well, hey, thank you very much for coming on with me tonight. This was a lot of fun. I love talking with you on the start sit. I love being able to talk about these kind of bigger picture questions with you, because we don't get to do that as much unless we're killing time on Sundays, which we very rarely are, because we're usually have questions coming fast and furious and need to rapid fire them. But thanks again for coming tonight.
Well, I appreciate having me on. This is a blast. Again, love talking football anytime we can. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and thanks for the listen last week. I know you mentioned that, as you guys said last week, oh man, that made me feel good. I really appreciate that.
I got my favorites. So
so in terms of what is still to come on IDP drafts, we'll be back in 2 weeks, as I mentioned, with one of the hosts of the IDP show, the flagship show in this platform, Mr. Josh Raymer, who has done, I don't know about every single D-Up draft that has occurred so far, but pretty close, if not all of them. So we'll be talking just D-Up strategies. We'll be talking roster composition. We'll be talking about your bonuses. We're either going to be doing or recapping an actual D-Up draft so you can see what they look like, how they feel, those sort of in-the-moment decisions. It's not the kind of thing where we'll be able to really talk through, hey, here's my thought process, because you got 20 seconds to hurry up and make your pick. So if you are in a state that has D-Up by Fast Draft, give it a shot before 2 weeks from now, and you'll learn some things to then go back and try to do even better. Make sure you use the IDP Show promo code to get yourself some bonus entries there as well with your deposit. And the other thing that I wanted to mention that Jake and I mentioned last time is we want you to draft with us. So we're still filling a combined best ball draft right now. Jeff has graciously agreed to join. So the longer you wait, the more co-hosts are just going to take these spots that you could be filling. So we only have, I think, 3 or 4 spots left in this first draft. They tend to fill a lot faster as the season goes on and more people are getting into the drafting spirit. But come draft with us. There will be a link to the sleeper draft. It's just a $5 buy-in. It's IDP and offense. You get to flex a lot of different muscles there. You're helping to build some new ADP for us to be able to have some of these conversations about deeper players as well to go alongside the D-Up ADP, which is just that very shallow pool. So come draft with us. And lastly, please remember, you like Jeff's work, you like my work, There's lots and lots of great stuff for you. Lots of great resources at theidpshow.com. There's the IDP show. There's the IDP after show. There's the rookie rankings. There's the IDP best ball rankings that we were referencing throughout the episode. There are articles. Really, anything you need from an IDP perspective is at your disposal there. And thank you very much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you in the draft.